With a history reaching over 40,000 years, did you know that the Indigenous Australian culture is one of the oldest continually existing cultures in the world? According to DNA tests conducted at the University of Copenhagen, Indigenous Australian people are the descendants of the first migrants to have left the birthplace of humanity in Africa some 75,000 years ago. Although Indigenous Australian culture tends to be named as though it were a single unit, it is far from monolithic. At the time of first contact with Europeans, some 500 distinct Indigenous nations were inhabiting Australia, speaking different languages and following their own religious and cultural practices, with a certain amount of overlap across cultures. As with all human societies, that of the Indigenous Australians is abounding in stories. One of the essential concepts connected to Indigenous Australian mythmaking and storytelling is that of the Dreamtime. Dreamtime refers to the Indigenous mythic past, the time of the ancestors when the world was newly made, and animals and birds lived and talked like people. The tales of Dreamtime deal with the origins of things, the stories of gods, heroes, and monsters, and tales about animals and birds. Here are 7 fascinating Australian legends and myths. The creation myth of Bayami and Yi. The responsibility for creating the world varies within the corpus of Australian myth. In some legends, the creator is the Rainbow Serpent, while in others, it is the god Bayami. At the beginning of the world, everything lay under a blanket of darkness. Out of the silence came Bayami. He went to Yi and whispered in her ear, "Yi, awake! The world is ready to have life. You must wake." Yi heard the whisper of Bayami and awoke. When she opened her eyes, the whole world was flooded with light. Yi could see the mountains and the plains, and her breath stirred the still air, making the first breezes blow. In some versions of the myth, Yi's act of creation is located on the Nullarbor Plain, which is located along the coast of South Australia and extends across the border into Western Australia. As the sun goddess walked in this area, grasses and flowers, trees and shrubs all sprang up, and soon the plains and the mountains were full of green and growing things, and many colored flowers glowed among the greenery. After resting for a while, Yi headed to the caverns of the earth, from where she brought forth insects, animals, and other living things. In one cavern, she melted ice, which flowed out of the cave in a mighty rush. It became a river flowing peacefully across the land, and the river was full of fish. In this cavern, Yi found things with feathers and stuff with fur. Soon birds of all kinds were flying out of the cavern to join Yi's other creatures, and all sorts of animals ran out into the new world with them. After explaining the laws of nature and the passing of seasons, she told her creation, "My work here is done. I must go and live in the sky now. I will still give you light and warmth and life, but I must do it from far away." The Rainbow Serpent and the Wawalak Sisters. Long ago, in the Dreamtime, Uluru, the Rainbow Serpent, created the world, and when he was done building, he went to dwell at the bottom of a deep water hole where the Leagalawamiri people live. There were no people yet, far back in the Dreamtime, until an exiled brother and his sisters came in a canoe to the eastern shore of the land. The descendants of the brother and the sisters settled along the coast, moving southward as their families grew and flourished. Now, among these descendants were 2 sisters named Garangal and Boalir. Garangal had a baby, but Boalir had not yet found a man. One day, a man approached Boalir and persisted in his affection for her. The 2 were considered relatives, and their relationship brought about Boalir's pregnancy. Fearing the punishment of incest, Boalir headed north with her sister, Garangal, and her son. Finally, the women arrived at the waterhole where Uluru lived. They stopped to make camp, and Boalir delivered a beautiful boy. Garangal went out into the bush to find food. She caught a bandicoot and some grubs, but the bandicoot returned to life and escaped into the waterhole. She then grabbed some plants, but they also disappeared into the waterhole. Unbeknownst to Garangal, she had fouled the pool with her menstrual blood. Uluru also smelled the new mother's blood and, in his anger, swallowed the babies and their mothers whole. Then he stretched his body up toward the sky once more. Other totemic serpents saw Uluru stretching himself up toward the sky. When the fellow snakes learned about Uluru's actions, they felt disgusted. Angry and ashamed, Uluru crashed his great body down to the earth. There are different stories about the fate of the women and their children, but according to consensus, they sent dreams to the wise men of their tribe, teaching them rituals, songs, and ceremonies. Uluru and Kanjus Boomerang. Uluru is a massive sandstone formation that stands above the plains of central Australia in the southern part of the Northern Territory. Uluru, called Ayers Rock by white colonists, is sacred to the Pajanchijaro Anangu people, who are indigenous to the area around Uluru. Ownership of Uluru was returned to the Pajanchijara in 1985, but a ban on climbing the monolith, something Indigenous Australians view as sinful, was not implemented until late 2019. The sides of Uluru are scored with many grooves and dotted with holes and caves. These features naturally became the subject of myths surrounding the creation and history of Uluru. One such is the legend of Kanjus, a lizard man who was the most excellent boomerang thrower in the world. One day, Kanjus went out into the bush with his best boomerang and hurled it with all his might. The boomerang flew through the air and buried itself deep into the sandstone of Uluru. After waiting for his boomerang to return, Kanjus looked for it. After a very long journey, he finally arrived at Uluru. There, he found his boomerang stuck deep into the sandstone. Kanjus began to scrabble at the rock, trying to free his boomerang. The traces of his digging still scar the face of Uluru in the deep scorings of the rock. The Frogman and the Bunyip. As we saw in the story of the Wawalak sisters, Indigenous Australians often take various animals as their tribal totem. Here, the tale partly explains why people of the frog totem do not eat their totemic animal. The villain of this story is the Bunyip, a monster native to Australia that lurks around billabongs, rivers, and lakes to stalk, catch, and devour the unwary. One day, a Bunyip jumped onto an unsuspecting hunter in a billabong. The man ran back to his home, but he ended up leading the Bunyip to his wife. The Bunyip captured his wife and took her away. The young man went to the billabong and caught several frogs, then tied them to a stick and stuck them in the water in the middle of the billabong. He did this for days, and the frogs disappeared every time. But on one fateful day, he saw the Bunyip, accompanied by the man's wife. He threw a spear that pierced the Bunyip, but failed to kill him. Following the injured Bunyip, the man reached a gum tree, where the Bunyip put him and his wife under a spell. For many days, the man and the woman stood at the foot of the tree. They yearned to touch one another, but were unable to move. Then one day, a terrible storm toppled the gum tree, killing the Bunyip. But the eye of the Bunyip remained where it was, and this is how the moon was made. The death of the Bunyip broke the spell on the young couple, who embraced and wept with joy. Balu and his dogs. Balu is simultaneously the moon itself and the god of the moon. Like many gods, he has the power to grant or deny eternal life. In this Just So story, we learn why humans must remain mortal. They have to choose whether to handle deadly snakes, which might bite and kill them, but grant them eternal life, or decline to hold the snakes, a decision that will keep them mortal. Balu had 3 snakes, which he called dogs. One day, he came across a group of men along a river. He asked them to cross the river with his dogs, but they respectfully refused because they were scared of their venomous bites. Balu threw a piece of bark in the river, followed by a stone. The bark floated on the surface, while the stone sank. Balu explained to the men that if they helped him, they would float like the bark. Otherwise, they would fall. Despite the promise of eternal life, the men were too afraid of snakes, so they declined. Disappointed, Balu waded into the river, never to come back again. But he sent many more snakes to live on the earth and trouble people. And so it is that when people die, they stay dead forever. And so it is that when people see one of Balu's dogs, they kill it as soon as possible. Although the theme of this story is quite severe, it does have a particular comic element. The humor resides in Balu's insistence that the deadly snakes he owns as pets are his dogs that he takes out for walks, as though his slithery friends were canines. How the kangaroo got its tail. In Dreamtime stories, the final form of an animal often results from one or more acts of violence. Here, the kangaroo gets its tail from a spear thrust, while the wombat gets its flat head from a blow with a rock. Miriam the kangaroo and Warreen the wombat looked like men when the world was new. Besides their shapes, there was another significant difference between Miriam and Warreen. Warreen liked to build himself a shelter made of bark where he could sleep warm and dry. Miriam, however, preferred to sleep outdoors. One day, as the sky warned of bad weather, Warreen suggested Miriam build a hut. Miriam did not pay much attention to Warreen's advice, which made him mad. So, when a storm arrived that night in all its fury, Miriam kept shivering out in the open. He asked Warreen to let him into his hut, but disappointed in his friend, Warreen declined. In his rage, Miram picked a rock and flattened Warreen's head. As he turned around to leave, Warreen grabbed and thrust a spear into the base of Miram's spine. And this is why wombats are short, round creatures with flat heads, while kangaroos are tall and thin with very long tails. Wombats live in dens, snug and dry, but kangaroos only ever sleep under whatever weather the world brings. How the turtle got its shell. As we have seen in the preceding animal tale, transgression is a primary cause of changes that give animals their appearance or even their existence, and this story is no different. Wayamba the turtle found himself wanting a wife. He looked for one among the women of his camp, but none of the turtle tribe women were pleasing to him. So he took a woman, Ula, from the spiny lizard people and brought her back. The turtle tribe was angry at Wayamba because they feared the spiny lizard people would come looking for Ula. Wayamba's hubris lay in first stealing a woman from a neighboring tribe and then thinking he could take on her enraged relatives by himself. When the spiny lizard people arrived, he tied a shield to the front and back of his body. After failing to hurt him with thrown spears, the spiny lizard people moved closer with their clubs. Under the barrage of clubs, Wayamba fled to a river and jumped into it. Ula returned with her tribespeople, and he was not seen for a while. A few days later, some people of the turtle tribe saw a strange creature with shields on the top and bottom. When the people picked up the creature, it pulled its head and legs into its shell. "So that's what became of Wayamba," said the people. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about Australian mythology, check out our book, Australian Mythology: Captivating Dreamtime Stories of Indigenous Australians. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.